In this content, we're going to be talking about when bad things happen, personal trauma, historical trauma, and resilience. Much of what I'm sharing with you has been taken either directly or adapted from chapters 2 and 3 in this book, Trauma-Informed Care in Behavioral Health Sciences, linked to the left. I've provided the chapters from this for you to read along with your other content. So trauma is any disturbing experience that results in significant fear, helplessness, dissociation, confusion, or other disruptive feelings, intense enough to have a long-lasting negative effect on a person's attitudes, behavior, and other aspects of functioning. We'll be teasing this definition out over the next couple slides. We can talk about 3 types of trauma. Acute trauma results from a single incident. One might have, for a time after a single trauma, some of these traumatic responses or emotional responses that we'll be discussing. Chronic trauma is repeated and prolonged trauma, such as domestic violence or abuse. And complex trauma is exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events, often of an invasive interpersonal nature. We might have some of their people in Ukraine experiencing this right now, this rather sudden trauma that might involve both the removal of their home and physical harm and psychological harm and a range of factors like that. And depending on how long this lasts, this could result in some serious traumatic responses for these people. So some ways we think about trauma. So first of all, we can have natural or human-caused trauma, and they do tend to have some slightly different impacts. Individual trauma could be a single event, like an attack, multiple events, like repeated abuse, or prolonged events, like cancer, affecting one person. Group trauma is when these types of events affect a particular group who are linked in some way. Some examples in your reading will be the first responders, those individuals who work for emergency services, who are the first to go into injured scenes, like the first to go into a house fire or the 9/11 bombing and that sort of thing. They have a particular exposure to trauma. War veterans similarly would have a similar exposure to the same kinds of traumas, so there's some connection among them and now the Ukrainian people. And, you know, not just Ukraine, we'll talk about that more in a bit. Community trauma, trauma affecting one community or culture, and certainly what happened to our Native American people, the land theft and deculturation through the removal of children from their home in native ways, all are prime examples of trauma affecting a culture. And tornado victims or victims of a localized, say, a flood or a tsunami are another example of this sort of thing. Historical trauma is when the trauma to an individual or to a group is severe enough to affect the next generations. And so we do have, again, the traumas that happened to African American people as they were taken from their homelands and as they were exposed here in this country to lynchings and other kinds of violence. And once again, the Native American people have had sufficient trauma in terms of the loss of culture, loss of community, loss of land, that these can be passed on. We will be looking at this more in the video you're going to watch about epigenetics, which doesn't directly talk about this, but explains it through the lens of the genome, how these kinds of traumatic events experienced by one's grandparents can still live within you or within an individual with the same triggering responses. Mass trauma, trauma affecting large numbers of people at one time. Interpersonal trauma, often thought of as domestic violence, and developmental traumas, trauma occurring in one stage of life that affects later stages, and these are called often adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, and we are having a lecture this week from a doctor who talks about these experiences and what we might do about it. So some examples of trauma caused by people and caused by nature. Natural trauma would include tornadoes, the lightning strikes, the wildfires, those that are happening year after year in California, might cause repeated traumas to the people living in those regions. Avalanche, physical ailment or disease. So we might say that COVID is a naturally caused physical trauma. A fallen tree, an earthquake, a dust storm, a volcano, a blizzard, depending on the harm. These are all dependent on the harm that's caused. And there are a range of other natural events. I'll point out in here a famine, or possibly the drought that led to famine among native peoples would be included here. Among those caused by people, we might have accidents, like train derailments, fall from a roof, a structural collapse, like the collapse of that big condo complex down in Florida with many people who did not survive. Mountaineering accidents, certainly airplane crashes, although they're rare, they are significant traumatic events. A car accident that happens due to some sort of error. Mine collapse, definitely human caused, or a fire in the mine. Radiation leak, the exposure to the impacts of the uranium mining up in the Navajo Nation is an example of this caused by people that leads to an accident or a catastrophe, the pollution of the water, the illness that came to the people. And that's not mentioning the harm or injuries that may have come to the miners themselves. The collapse of a crane, a gas explosion, some sort of electrocution from a downed power line or something like that. An oil spill, gun shootings, sports-related deaths. So all of these are examples of human-caused catastrophes that lead to accidents or tech errors. And then intentional acts, and these are very challenging as well. Arson, someone intentionally causing harm to you. We can look at terrorism and think of all of this as creating terror in an individual because another person is intentionally causing this kind of trauma to you or to whoever is the victim. Sexual assault and abuse, homicides, suicides, mob violence or rioting, physical abuse and neglect, stabbing, shooting, warfare, domestic violence, intentional poisoning of one's water supply, human trafficking, school violence, torture, home invasion, bank robbery, genocide, or the murder of an entire attempt to eliminate an entire population of people, medical or food tampering, a scare that happened a couple decades ago when someone took bottles of aspirin and poisoned the aspirin that were in them. All of these things are intentional acts that can cause traumatic responses. We'll talk in a little bit about the differences that can occur due to culture. So an event might happen and different groups of people may react differently. And I took this one out of your reading, but this is a chief up in Port Graham up in Alaska where a big oil spill had contaminated all of the water and killed a great bit of wildlife. And the quote from this chief of that area said, "The excitement of the season had just begun, and then we heard the news. Oil in the water, lots of oil, killing lots of water. It is too shocking to understand. Never in the millennium of our tradition have we thought it possible for the water to die, but it is true." And your authors write, of all the groups negatively affected by the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989, in many ways, Alaskan natives were the most devastated. The oil spill destroyed more than the economic resources. It shook the core cultural foundation of native life. Alaska native subsistence culture is based on an intimate relationship with the environment. Not only does the environment have sacred qualities for Alaska Natives, their survival also depends on the well-being of the ecosystem and the maintenance of cultural norms of subsistence. The spill directly threatened the well-being of the environment, disrupted subsistence behavior, and severely disturbed the sociocultural milieu of Alaska Natives. And so while the Exxon Valdez oil spill was a natural disaster that caused distress and harm for many people, it was notably and more pronounced harm to Alaska Native people who, for a variety of spiritual, traditional, as well as economic reasons, depended on that water. So we can think of the impact of trauma as like an event that hits the water's surface, and we'll use this metaphor again later. So this water is like your emotions, the surface of your personality, what you're feeling. And you can see that when the rock hits the water, this is like the traumatic event, like the harm that came to you. And the ripples moving outward from this event are the passage of time. So the immediate impact is great and profound, and there are acute effects of the trauma. And then as time passes, going outward away from the traumatic event, the waves, the ripples get smaller and smaller gradually. And finally, the event becomes one that is dissociated from the pain. And that's a healthy recovery to trauma. But as you probably well know, sometimes the ripples don't get smaller. It doesn't get integrated and fall away. And the same, even smaller events that are similar to the initial trauma can cause this very deep ripple and these long-term effects. And that is beyond the scope of this class, but we won't be talking about stress disorders or trauma-based disorders, but you can think of it within this metaphor in any way. So what happens in response to trauma? So first there's that initial reaction when the rock hits the water, so to speak, and then there's the delayed reaction. That is those waves that are continuing outward to affect in more subtle ways, but to still affect. And so the immediate emotional reaction to a traumatic event is sort of a numbness, a detachment, a feeling of unreality, maybe anxiety or great fear, and perhaps guilt if you survived and another didn't, or guilt over actions you might have taken and didn't take. Exhilaration, you made it. Anger, sadness, helplessness, this feeling of being out of control. Feeling unreal, depersonalization, as if you are outside your body watching yourself. Disorientation, a feeling of being out of control, denial, constriction of feelings, and a feeling of being overwhelmed. And all of these are signs of immediate reaction to trauma or an acute traumatic reaction. But then later on, even though these big emotions fade and you may come to these delayed reactions, which might be this irritability or hostility, maybe your partner or family is noticing that you are really lashing out or overreacting, depression, and maybe some mood swings, like a feeling that your moods are controlling you and you have lost control. Maybe some anxiety, generalized, maybe everything making you anxious, or a particular fear of something, one thing. A fear about the trauma recurring, maybe some grief reactions, and maybe shame. Feelings of fragility or vulnerability. And this feeling maybe of emotional detachment. So not just from that event, but any event that requires an emotional reaction, you might be distanced from your emotion, like not feeling the joy that you might feel when your child accomplishes something, or not fully experiencing grief that you would expect to feel upon the loss of someone in your life. And so your normal emotional reactions are blunted and out of fear of this big reaction. There are also some physical reactions. Immediately at the site of a trauma, you might feel nausea, stomach upset, sweating, shivering, faintness, muscle tremors, or uncontrollable shaking, elevated heartbeat, respiration, and blood pressure, extreme fatigue or exhaustion, a greater startle response, you're jumping at small things, and this depersonalization or feeling of unreality. And later on, however, after that main effect has passed, you might still have sleep disturbances and nightmares. You might have somatization, soma meaning body, increased focus and worry about body aches and pains. Appetite and digestive changes, lowered resistance to colds and infection. Your immune system might be impacted by the stress hormone. Persistent fatigue, elevated cortisol levels, hyperarousal, keyed up feeling. And then long-term health effects can come from this too, with this chronic elevation of stress hormone that comes from not integrating this stress experience. You might have changes in your thinking, cognitive reactions. Right away, probably you're having difficulty concentrating right after the trauma. You might have rumination, that is, you're thinking and replaying the event over and over, or you might have racing thoughts. You might have a sense of distortion of time and space, that is, recalling the traumatic event as if it was happening in slow motion. You might have memory problems, not being able to recall important aspects of the trauma, and you might really strongly identify with other victims through this shared traumatic experience. And in the long term, after these initial immediate effects have been blunted, you might still have intrusive memories or flashbacks, reactivation of previous traumatic events, self-blame. You might become preoccupied with the event. It might be hard to make decisions. You might find yourself flummoxed or frozen when you have decisions to make. You might get a bit of magical thinking, a belief that certain behaviors, like avoiding certain things as an example, will protect against future trauma. So you might have a belief that feelings or memories are dangerous. You might have generalization of triggers. And what that means is that this is the example of a veteran who has been exposed to a bomb blast, who now reacts to a car backfiring with the same fear and suicidal thinking. And all of these can be delayed reactions, indicative perhaps of someone who might get some help working through the trauma. Some examples of this cognitive triad of traumatic stress. So what happens is your views change about the world, about the self, and about the future. And your views about the world may have changed. Now you see the world as a dangerous place. Now you see people who cannot be trusted. Now you see life as unpredictable. You can't control it. And so those are views about the world that change through traumatic stress. Views about yourself might change. I'm incompetent. I should have reacted differently. I can't handle it. It's too much for me. I feel damaged. So these are some examples of views about the self that might change, and views about the future. Things will never be the same. What is the point? I'll never get over this. It is hopeless. And so this is all examples of the impact of this trauma in that disturbed state after the traumatic event. You might also have behavioral reactions to the trauma. Your actions might change. So immediately you might have a startled reaction and then a restlessness, a hard time settling down. You might not sleep or eat like normal. Your sleep and appetite could be disturbed. It might be hard for you to express yourself or find the right words to talk about it. You might tend to be argumentative. You might find that you have increased your use of alcohol, drugs, and tobacco. You might find yourself withdrawn and apathetic, and you might have avoidant behaviors, avoiding certain situations. And in the long term, you might still, even after these acute effects fade, you might still have some delayed impacts, like the avoidance of things that remind you of that event. You might have disturbances in your social relationships. Think about that irritability and argumentativeness that you might be experiencing. You might have decreased activity level, not feeling very motivated to do things. You might engage in high-risk behaviors, taking less care to remain healthy. Increased use of drugs and alcohol, and withdrawal. And finally, there are some existential reactions, like immediately right at the time of the trauma, a person might have intense use of prayer. If you receive help from others, you might have a surge of faith in the goodness of others. Maybe a loss of self-efficacy, that self-efficacy being the feeling that you can cope with whatever comes, but in the face of the trauma, it's too much and you can't cope. And this might lead you to think you're not competent and to use that prayer to think that you need greater help than you can provide. Despair about humanity, particularly if the event was intentional. And disruptions about the assumptions you've had about life, like that life is fair or the world is safe and that sort of thing. And these might morph in time into delayed reactions, like questioning why this happened to you, or a feeling of cynicism, disillusionment. You might have more self-confidence. If I can survive this, I can survive anything. Loss of purpose, renewed faith maybe. These responses can vary. You might set new priorities. Now you've realized life is short and you want to pay more attention to your family. Redefining the meaning and importance of life, and then reworking life's assumptions to accommodate the trauma. There are some cultural factors that impact trauma, and this will be gone over in your book a little bit, but we can think here that some populations are more likely to experience certain types of trauma. Traumatic stress impacts diverse populations and cultures facing military action. Culture determines whether events are perceived as traumatic. For some, being moved from one's home might be traumatic, but for others it might not be. For example, traumas may have a greater impact on a given culture because of significance related to traditional practices or ways of life, as happened again with the removal of land from Native people. Culture determines what's acceptable in terms of responses to trauma and how one can express their reaction to trauma. The stress symptoms themselves will vary. In some cultures, one would only feel comfortable talking about bodily ills, and in other cultures, it would be more acceptable to talk about psychological ailments. Culture determines how and when someone might seek help and what type of help they would seek. And culture can also give a source of strength, giving coping strategies and specific resources. And I think of this as also a part of what is imbued by the ceremonial practices of the Navajo people. What makes some people resilient or safe from traumatic events and others more vulnerable? We'll start with this diagram on the right. So we think of what we call a diathesis stress framework, and these are like the predispositions or the conditions that exist long ago that set the stage for a person to have a particular difficult reaction to trauma. So one might have genetic predisposition, and that includes the epigenetic phenomena that are talked about in the video by Courtney Griffiths. So you might have in your genes to have a certain reaction to certain traumas. And then if you experienced trauma long ago, early in your life, that can set the stage. And there are other factors like that that can set the stage for the emergence of vulnerability to a reaction to trauma or other mental disorder. And those types of things are called diatheses, and it's your vulnerability or the predisposition. And then a couple things happen during your life. Either your life doesn't have much stress, No, you don't experience trauma later in life. It's pretty peaceful, it's good. Or you have a life in which you have a lot of stressful circumstances. So either of those outcomes can happen, or something in the middle. And these factors, even if you have a lot of diatheses setting the stage for the development of disorder, in minimal stress conditions later, there's a lower probability of a mental disorder or a reaction, a big reaction to some certain event. But if you have these diatheses and then you have really stressful circumstances, you're more likely to develop a disorder. So why do some people who do have maybe all of these diatheses and stressful later on still not develop a disorder? Well, the factor seems to be these protective factors. And protective factors provide like a cushion, and they take maybe these excessive stressful circumstances and dilute them so that they don't morph into a disorder. So we'll look at just all of these at once. Health is an example of a protective factor. If the health is overall good, if the food is good, the diet is good, the exercise is good, that provides a factor for resilience, a protective factor. If a person has a lot of good social support that includes physical touch, this can be a protective factor. For children, one of the factors that made the most significant difference in terms of protecting them from the impacts of trauma is having just one significant adult in their life. One adult who's there, steady, dependable. It does not have to be a parent. The parents might not be at that stage in their lives to be steady and dependable. It takes one person. And so I think of that often because each of us could be that one person. Having a safe home makes a difference. People who are homeless or have home vulnerability are much more vulnerable to the development of mental disorders in the face of stressors. They also probably have more stressors. And an interesting thing is there's a thing called stress inoculation, and that is if you experience a moderate stressor when you're young, nothing too severe, nothing too long-lasting, but it's moderate, strong enough, it protects you a bit from having a reaction to later stressors. It's almost like you've had an inoculation or a vaccination, and now your body's immune to the effects of more severe stressors. So triggers are stimuli such as smell, sound, or sight that affects your emotional state, regardless of your mood, bringing out the feelings associated with the trauma. And so if you were a victim of childhood abuse, then say just being told what to do might bring out a really big reaction for you. And we could think about it with this metaphor. We could think about normally looking at the splash that's in the water here, again going back to the metaphor of the surface of the water being your own surface, your emotion. And normally it would take a pretty big rock to make this kind of splash. But if you've been traumatized, you might get this kind of splash from this very small rock. A small rock may cause this large splash and these ripples that can even last over time. And so that's like the triggers we talk about in psychology. It's an event that really shouldn't be that distressing that's causing you a good deal of distress and a big emotional reaction. And that is the result of unprocessed traumatic events. And one thing to think about when you're working through this is that all of this that happens on the surface, it isn't your true self, your deep self. Your deep self is like where you would go deep, 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 deep below the surface. And below the surface, no matter what's happening on top, there's clear, still, quiet. And we can think of the true self as being that. And so even if this is happening at the top, some of your healing practice, if a person has had trauma, is to become accustomed to diving deep, deep, deep below the surface and finding the true self and the peace within. So there are 3 phases of trauma recovery, and we'll start with the quote on the right. Healing doesn't mean the pain never existed. It means the damage no longer controls our lives. And the first phase is safety and stabilization. So if a person has just experienced a traumatic event, someone has just been raped or the victim of some house fire or something like that, first this person needs to find a place of safety, both physical and emotional safety. There's a lot of stress hormone going through at this time. The trauma has caused a tumult like a shaken bottle, and if that's opened too fast, it's not going to be beneficial. It'll be explosive. So working with someone in that condition the work has to be slow and gradual, and it has to be focused really on just providing safety. After time, after that safety and stabilization has been achieved, then remembrance and mourning, then the person begins to integrate this experience, remembering it and talking about it without triggering that fight or flight response, decoupling the event from this primal emotion. And so this happens after the person feels safe. And that's when this integration can take place, talking about it, and this event is now being remembered without that vulnerability feeling that had happened earlier. And then finally, reconnection and integration. This is like the redefining of the self, the recovery, the growth that can come from trauma. And it might involve setting new goals in your life or helping others with their trauma, but it's like a redefinition of the self. An acceptance that this trauma happened, that there's no changing that, and yet no longer is it controlling you. It's just been integrated into you in a way that's now allowing you to help others. So treatment for trauma really is beyond the scope of this course, and it's an individual process. We can have some general ideas in a course like this, but it's a process that really does take some work. And so we aren't really going to go deeply into that here. If one of you does feel that you would like to examine this more deeply for a project, you can offer that for your project choice 3. Other than that, we're not going to go into it anymore. So what we are covering are these things. So first you're going to watch this lecture, which you presumably have done already. And then the tips document that I put up there, these are chapters from the book I shared with you on the first slide, and they're posted on for you. And these will provide more detail for the lecture. Then you'll watch the ACEs video, just one. I took the other one down. And in this one, you will hear about childhood adverse experiences in an excellent talk by a pediatrician. You'll read the Begay article on collective historical trauma. You'll watch the epigenetics video that will explain how these effects that happened generations ago can still be residing within people so much later. And then finally, you'll read the dream chapter in Walker, and that's the sleep book. And you will learn about how the dream state itself helps with this integration, which may help explain why the sleep deficiencies that happen after a trauma may contribute to the traumatic reaction.